Okay, in celebration of hitting 100 subscribers, finally, I've decided to do a viewer request video, which is a coolant system servicing on my 2012 Nissan Pathfinder. To do this, you need some paper towels, a Phillips head screwdriver, engine antifreeze coolant 50-50 mix, which I grabbed at Nissan, which I'll explain a little more later. I found 4 to be adequate for how I do it. I'm using some vinyl gloves, 2 drip pans, and a funnel. So the first step in this process is to remove the radiator cap from the top of the radiator. And it's important to note that this radiator cap is simply a non-vented cap, so there's no valve system on it. And that's because the valve is actually on the expansion tank, because the expansion tank is pressurized. Now before draining anything, I'm going to turn the ignition to the on position and turn the heater controls to high. I'm going to leave it on for 10 seconds and then turn it off. The reason for doing this is to ensure the valves to the heater core are open. I'm now ready to drain the radiator, and as you can see, there is one screw on the passenger side of the radiator. It is a small plastic Phillips head screw. Now because this is a plastic screw, it is very susceptible to damage, so you're going to want to use the correct size Phillips head screwdriver for it. One point to note is that the splash guard is only slightly in the way, so I did not take it off. However, when you're unscrewing and screwing in the drain plug here, I would recommend pulling down on the splash guard so that it doesn't cause the screw to go in at an improper angle. Now you can see the reason why I'm doing this coolant change, in addition to having a viewer request it. The fluid coming out of the radiator is clearly a green color. You can even see it in the video, whereas the Nissan branded fluid is actually blue. Now because I got this vehicle used at pretty high mileage, I have no idea when it was done, so that's also a factor. However, as anyone with a Nissan probably knows, particularly a Pathfinder, a Frontier, or an Xterra, these vehicles very well could have the coolant and transmission fluid mix within the radiator if there is a deterioration of the transmission line that runs through the radiator. So using the correct fluid is important. Now at this point, if you wanted to drain the engine block of coolant as well, there are drain bolts on each side of the engine block. For me, I didn't think it was worth the effort, as the bolts are not easy to reach, and as well, because I'm in Canada, I would also have to remove the block heater, which I did not want to do. I'm confident that I got enough fluid exchanged with 2 drain processes. So you can see here, I did require the 2 drip pans. It is just slightly more than 1. I would say approximately 7 liters. It took about 30 minutes for it to completely stop draining from the radiator. Now before we fill the radiator, I'm just going to put the radiator drain plug back in. I don't have a torque spec on that, but because it's a plastic screw, I'd be very careful not to over tighten it and either strip it or break it off. Nothing too crazy here. I'm using the Nissan branded coolant and a funnel to refill the radiator, and I found that just slightly less than 2 jugs of coolant was required to refill the radiator. So if you just want to drain it and fill the radiator, 2 jugs is more than enough. I've decided to use 4 jugs because I'm going to drain and fill, I'm going to run the engine up, and then I'm going to drain it and fill it again. Now if you're having trouble pouring out of these jugs, initially it is beneficial to pour from the side to get that first half liter out, and then you can pour using the handle thereafter, and it avoids a bit of the mess. If you're doing a more comprehensive flush, that is doing this process more than one time, you may consider using deionized water for the first flush. So once the radiator is filled, I am now going to fill the expansion tank up to the full line on the expansion tank bottle. Now if your expansion tank was dirty, this may be a good time to remove it. It's only held in by 3 bolts, and you could take it inside and clean it up if that's what you want to do. For me, I didn't find the tank was dirty. As well, when I drained the radiator fluid from the radiator, I also found the expansion tank emptied out. Now, prior to starting the vehicle, we're going to put the cap back on the expansion tank, as well as back on to the radiator. You can see the radiator is full of coolant. And before I start the vehicle, because I have the garage door closed, I'm going to open the garage door so I don't fill the garage with carbon monoxide. Now we start the vehicle and we let it warm up, ensuring that the heater is on high. As well, we're going to ensure that the rear heat is on high. Now it's recommended that you just bring the RPMs up a little bit to help circulate the fluid throughout the system. Once I do that for a few seconds, I'm just going to let the vehicle warm up and get up to operating temperature. Alright, now that about 5 minutes have passed, you can see the temperature is coming up in the temperature gauge. As well, you have to take my word for it, you can feel the air coming through the vents is heating up. So after an additional 5 minutes, the engine is now at full operating temperature, and you can turn off the vehicle, and now you're going to have to let the vehicle cool down before you open the radiator cap. Now if you just want to drain and fill your radiator, this is where you would end this procedure, but because I am going to do the procedure twice, I'm going to take off the radiator cap. Again, I'm going to turn the ignition to the on position without actually turning the vehicle over, and ensure that all the heater settings are set to high prior to opening up the drain bolt on the radiator. So you can see that I've unscrewed the radiator drain screw, and that the coolant is now blue that is coming out of the radiator, which is a good thing, as it should be. Here's a close-up of the radiator drain plug. As you can see, there's a little rubber gasket that I did not display very well the first time around. Because just slightly over 7 liters of fluid comes out of the radiator, I would recommend changing your catch basins. So here's the amount of fluid that came out the second time, approximately 3.5 liters in each. Now before I put the radiator drain plug back in, I'm just going to wipe down all the little drips of coolant that is on the plastic housing, and I'm going to screw the radiator drain plug back in. And again, I recommend that you pull down the plastic skid plate when you're screwing in this plastic screw, just so you don't cross thread it. Again, plastic screw, likely easy to strip out. Now that the plug's back in the radiator, you can go ahead and fill the radiator back up with the proper coolant. Now one point to note, I do have the vented cap off the expansion tank when I'm filling the radiator, and now that the radiator is full, I'm going to just fill up the expansion tank, and now that both are filled up, I'll put the vented cap back on the expansion tank, and I will put the unvented cap back onto the radiator. Once again, you can see the radiator is completely full of coolant. And finally, for the sake of safety, we'll keep the garage door open while I'm running up the vehicle. So with the radiator filled, I'll turn the vehicle back on, ensure that the heater, both front and rear, are turned to high so that there's air flowing through them, and I'll let the vehicle warm up to full operating temperature. Now as you can see, the vehicle is back up to operating temperature. Again, I didn't let it warm up as long this time since the engine's already warm from the last time it was run up, and I'll bring the RPMs up to about 2,000 to 3,000 RPMs for a few seconds, just to ensure that the coolant is circulating throughout the entire system. Once that's done, we'll turn the vehicle off and ensure that all the coolant levels are back to the appropriate level. Now again, we'll let the vehicle cool down thoroughly and inspect the expansion tank to ensure that the coolant is to the fill line. In this case it was low, so I'm going to add some more coolant to ensure that it is actually at the right level, and that pretty much wraps up the entire job. So I would estimate that it took me about 1 hour to do each drain and fill cycle, because the vehicle had to cool down between drain and fills. and that really ate up quite a bit of time. When I called the dealerships locally, they quoted me at $215. However, that was for a drain and fill, which obviously I did twice in this case. I called another dealership just to ask them their procedure, and they said they do a flush for that price, but they didn't really get into details on the procedure. So overall, I would say this is definitely a good cost savings to do this by yourself, and overall it's a pretty easy job. Thanks for checking out my video, and a big thank you to my first 100 subscribers.